Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Amber Stinger, and I am president of the League of Women Voters of Johnson County. The League is proud to be nonpartisan, neither supporting nor opposing candidates or political parties at any level. Today, as I'm sure you're all aware, is the 20th anniversary of the deadliest terrorist attacks on US soil. Before we begin today's program, I'd like to take a moment to honor and remember the 2,977 people who lost their lives. To commemorate the victims, let's observe a few moments of silence, please. Thank you for joining me in that reflection and remembrance. Today, we continue our efforts to educate and engage voters, one of the primary reasons the League of Women Voters was founded more than 100 years ago. We are hosting this event because we think it's important for all of us to understand how we can improve our democracy to create a truly representative government. That's why we are grateful to our esteemed panelists today for taking the time to talk to us about this important topic. Here's our plan for today. In the first hour, our panelists will discuss the national popular vote, the Electoral College, and how we should elect our presidents. Following that, they will take some of your questions. Then we'll move right into a short workshop about redistricting and the importance of community mapping. We'll end the event with a few organizational announcements. To help our event run smoothly, we want to go over a few things. First, please use the chat box to ask questions. We've set the chat options so that only the panelists will see your questions and comments. Once the panel discussion begins, we recommend you watch the program in gallery view. You can switch the layout on your screen by clicking view in the top right corner and selecting gallery. Click on the chat icon in your controls at the bottom of the screen to get the chat box to appear. If you're using a tablet or phone, you may have to tap the more button to get the chat box option. Also, the program will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel in the next few days. Now, I'm delighted to introduce Janet Milkovich, Vice President of our League and the person responsible for creating this dynamic panel. Janet returned to the Kansas City area a few years ago after she retired from her executive leadership role of a nonprofit in the Chicago area. In just a short time, she has made a substantial difference, not only to the League, but throughout our community. Thank you, Janet, and now I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Amber. It's good to be back with our leaguers after a couple months absence. We're so fortunate today to have two experts with us to discuss the complicated topics of the national popular vote and the Electoral College and examine just how is our president elected. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrea Vieux. Andrea is a member of the League, first of all, and the Associate Professor of Political Science at Johnson County Community College. Andrea's research centers on finding effective ways to engage younger generations in the community, which is so in line with what we're trying to do at the League. Welcome, Andrea. Thank you for being here. And it's also my pleasure to introduce Dr. Paul Schumacher, who is the author of multiple books on today's subject, and he is the Professor Emeritus of Political Sciences at KU. When I asked the head of the Political Science Department at KU to recommend a speaker, he immediately said that Paul is the person for the job, and I know you will agree. So thank you both for being here today. It's a pleasure to have you, and I'm sure everybody is clapping around the field here. And so if you'd like to take your unmute, we're just going to move into our first line of questioning. The first part of our program will focus on the Electoral College. And just to refresh our memories, there are 538 electoral voters. Every state is given one electoral vote for each member of Congress, which includes, of course, the House and the Senate. Then the electors meet in December to cast their ballots for president. As Andrea reminded me this morning, it takes 270 electoral voters to win for president. So Andrea and Paul, in a nutshell, what was the original logic of the Electoral College? And either one of you can jump in on that.
Andrea, you want to go first?
I mean, I was going to wait for if you wanted to go first, but either way, it's fine with me.
All right,
Well, I got
Paul,
a long
why don't-
answer, but okay. So here's where what I would say. I would say that it's kind of contested among scholars what was the original intent of the Electoral College. I'd say that there's three broad interpretations. One is that there really isn't a set, a good principled explanation, that it was a last minute concoction, that the framers had struggled with the question of how to elect the president for almost 3 months after they began meeting, and they couldn't come to any agreement. They wanted to get to a situation where the people at the convention supported the overall design of the Constitution in order to create a national government. So at near the end of the convention, late in August, when everybody was hot and tired, they agreed to this concoction. A second explanation, in other words, it's just a jerry-rigged solution. The other explanation is that they didn't have a consistent set of principles for coming up with a electoral design. Some were pretty democratic, some were more like Hamilton was kind of wanted a elected monarch, and others wanted a Republican form of government. So because they had a variety of motivations, I think that the overall emphasis is that they didn't want a highly democratic system. There was a great deal of anxiety about citizen involvement, flowing from the colonial experience, that the colonies had not been particularly effective because, for example, they had given voters the right to recall representatives who they thought were not adequately representing their views. And that had made just for a kind of chaotic, ineffective government. So they wanted to have stronger leaders that could exercise their own independent judgments about what to do. And third motivation was, I think, and this is the most important, they wanted to avoid having a demagogue as president. Mm-hmm. They didn't want somebody who was highly charismatic, full of rhetoric, pandered to citizen votes. They wanted somebody who was well qualified, who was highly experienced, and widely trusted. And they thought by this jerry-rigged solution, the electors in the college would scan the whole American country for the most obvious people, those characteristics, was not a demagogue, but was qualified and widely trusted.
Oh, great explanation. Thank you, Paul. And Andrea, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Well, I agree with what Dr. Schumacher just said, in the sense of, a skepticism about people's abilities or citizen participation. And then, we also have to think about the Constitution itself being designed in a way to get people to ratify it, right? And maybe that's a simpler way of saying it. And then the other thing that I like to focus on when I'm thinking about American government is the way that some of the design of institutions controls political power relative to what Dr. Schumacher was just saying, making sure that we don't have a demagogue, or so we're protecting the republic, if you will.
Okay, thank you. And Andrea, if I could bring the second question to you, Is the Electoral College consistent with democratic, as in small d, principles?
I suppose it depends on how you look at things. So if we look at things from a state perspective and the idea that states have a role in our system of government, then it does perhaps give states, it does create, a more democratic system because states have a voice. If you're looking at it from the citizen perspective or the people's perspective, it really isn't consistent with democratic principles because it sort of takes away the voice of the people and gives it to states as an aggregate.
And Paul, you want to weigh in on that question?
Sure. I agree with Andrea. I do think that there was a great deal of concern about making sure that the states as states, qua states, had representation or a role to play in the presidential election. Otherwise, they wouldn't have delegated to the state legislatures the process of selecting electors. They gave states full authority to do what they wanted, and some states chose to have elect the electors themselves. Some chose to have the citizens, a small group of citizens, qualified property owners, men, etc., exercise their franchise and determine who the electors would be. So yes, initially they had some sort of process which gave the states significant power. But we have had a great deal of emphasis on individual, as Andrea was saying, that individuals ought to be the decision makers, the chief agents of making the decision about presidents. And from that perspective, there are several criteria that are democratic that are not well served by the Electoral College. The first such thing is individual political equality. Now, I want to emphasize, this does not mean every individual ought to have economic wealth or like that, or even equal power. They just ought to have a baseline of power, an equal vote, one person, one vote, to put it in the vernacular. And that has been undermined by that provision that when we introduced this, that each state would get a elector for having a senator. And since all states got 2 senators, that means that small states with only 1 representative but 2 senators would have disproportionate clout compared to states that had, let's say, 2 senators and 55 representatives. The best way of explaining that is today, Wyoming, if you live in Wyoming, a person from Wyoming, 175 Wyoming residents would exist for every elector. But in California, it would take 750,000 representatives to have a claim on 1 elector. In other words, if you're from California, you have 4 times the voting weight as you have if you're from Wyoming. So in short, there's not any equality among individuals in voting weight, depending on whether they come from a large populated state or a small, relatively unpopulated state.
Gotcha.
And then we could go on to the other things. I mean, there are other criteria here that are undermined. Neutrality is undermined. Initially, there was an intention to have a biased system. They wanted a system that would give more weight to smaller states in order to get them to agree to the old constitutional design. And as been emphasized by recent scholarship, they wanted the slave states to sign on. And then in order to have the slave states sign on, the slave states they were concerned about having too much power in the northern states, which had more citizens. And so they created a variety of things, including the Electoral College, which would give disproportionate weight or a bias towards small slave states. Finally, there's on that score, there's also a question of inclusion. I mean, today we now think it's very important for everybody to feel included in the overall governance of our society. But now, given the capacity of campaign managers and people who are in governance, they are very well aware that they don't need to have everybody included in their governing coalition or in their electorate base. They just need enough to win. And so they tend to exclude from consideration all kinds of people who are not necessary for them to win electoral victories or legislative victories. And
Really,
that all rises out of not just the way the Electoral College gives more representation to small states, but to the most probably to if you come from a safe state or a state that's competitive. If you're from if here we are in Kansas, we're safe. We know we're going to go Republican. So we are ignored. We are not included in the calculations of campaign managers, candidates, and so forth in figuring out where they want to get their votes, where they need their votes to come from to win.
I really appreciate, as you're both answering, putting it in the historical perspective and then bringing up to contemporary times. I think that's really important that we see this as a living topic that still needs to be addressed. And we have one more question about the Electoral College before we move on. And Andrea, I'll flip back to you so Paul could take a drink of water. But it's been said that the Electoral College is an institution that is in crisis. So what are some of the major criticisms of the Electoral College? Paul referenced a couple, but what would you add to that?
Right. I mean, well, Paul was talking, some of those did start to come out. So one of them is that states, because of the way the Electoral College votes are allocated to states, it creates disproportionate representation. So one person's vote in one state doesn't have as much meaning as people's votes in other states. The other negative that Paul mentioned was, smaller states with a fewer number of Electoral College votes are less likely to get any sort of attention from presidential candidates because it's just not in their interest to spend time or money on campaigning in a state that either A, they know they're going to win, B, or they know they're going to lose, or the total votes are so small that it's kind of a moot, issue. Of course, the third one, and I'm sure that we are all aware of, is that the biggest crisis is that the Electoral College is selecting winners that weren't chosen by people. They were chosen by states.
Yeah, we could rest on that topic for a while, couldn't we? That's, Paul, you have anything to add to that part?
Well, I think the last point that Andrea mentioned is the one that's most obvious to most citizens, is that there is what we call mismatch between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. And on 5 occasions, twice in this century, with the winners, with Bush winning in 2000 and Trump winning in 2016, we had that situation. Now, I'm not a big fan of that criticism, however, because we really don't know what the popular will is. We only can estimate what the popular will is by how by a particular method of counting votes. And so, for example, if we had a national popular plurality election where just the person getting the most votes would win, we could easily have a different outcome than if we had a national popular vote where you needed a majority to win. Think of it this way: in the last election, the 2016 election, Trump won the Electoral College vote, but he lost the popular vote by like, what was it, 4 million votes, something, 3 million votes. But if we had so plurality, he would have lost to Hillary Clinton. But if we had a national popular majority system, it's not hard to imagine that the 5 million votes that went disproportionately or went mostly to Johnson, the libertarian candidate, they would have gravitated over to the Republican. And so that Trump probably would have beaten Hillary in a national popular election. So what's the will of the people? Depends on how you're measuring it.
Right. Thank you. That's an excellent point. And also, as we're talking about the facts here, we want to stress again that we are nonpartisan. So you're talking about examining elections, and we're not endorsing any candidate that won or did not. So my little editorial comment. Andrea, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, and I think the other thing that this is kind of circling around, and it kind of goes to Paul's point, if the Electoral College wasn't what we were using and we were using something else, you might have a different turnout in your elections because, going back to a point that he made earlier, in Kansas, if you already know Kansas is going to go Republican in the Electoral College, there is sometimes that, why should I show up? And so one of the criticisms coming from that is basically that because people don't think their vote's going to matter in the grand calculation, that turnout suffers as a result. So it is true that if there was a different system, that might incentivize more people to get involved.
Right.
Yep. There's one other point I want to make here to bring this more even up to date.
Okay.
Be up to date now, just if we think of 1/6/21, the insurrection, and the whole process underlying that, this is something I don't think ever came to the minds of even presidential scholars or people interested in presidential elections, that one element of the Electoral College, the very counting of votes by Congress on the first Tuesday or Monday after the election, could be more than just a ceremonial thing, that the losers could challenge the electors coming from contested states. And if you could contest enough, and so that those votes would not be counted. That's what that was all about. If they could keep the number of electors from being counted so they couldn't get 270 votes authorized by Congress, then the House of Representatives would get to elect the president. And the House of Representatives, the way that works is every state gets one vote, depending on the composition of their congressional, their House delegation. It turns out right now that 27 House delegations are Republican, and so that's what Trump was trying to do. He was trying to ensure that the House would do the electorate, and then he could count on those 27 states to support him. Now that was some problems with that. I mean, Liz Cheney probably would not have cast the Wyoming vote for Trump. So there's always some wild guesses that have to go into that. But
Yeah, there's some
I think that
frightening
this is a,
hypotheticals here, I think, right?
I'm sorry,
There's some frightening hypotheticals.
very frightening.
Yeah,
But I do, be hypothetical, I think the cat's out of the bag now. And so I do think that we would now could expect votes challenged in the House when they're, or in the Congress, when they're counted, even after they've been cast by the states, with attempt to undermine not only the popular will, but the Electoral College vote, if it doesn't accord with what the members of Congress want.
right. Well, there's so much more to talk about with the Electoral College, but I know that people that are on the call today really want to talk about the national popular vote as well. And then we'll get in a few questions in chat that I think we're answering as we go. But when we finish our conversation with you, we will review all the questions coming in from our participants. So the national popular vote would guarantee that whichever candidate receives the most votes becomes the president. And one of our participants asked about the number of presidents that have won by popular vote. So it's interesting to note that 5 of 45 presidents won with fewer popular votes because of the Electoral College. So would moving from the Electoral College to the national popular vote require a constitutional amendment? And then, Andrea, would you like to take that?
Well, if we're talking about using the vote totals from voting as opposed to what we're going to get to later is the Interstate Compact, then the answer to moving from the Electoral College to the national popular vote would require a constitutional amendment. But we can get to some of the other ways to get around that
Okay.
in a moment.
Okay. Paul, do you agree or disagree?
Well, we would need to get to any national popular vote of a constitutional amendment for sure.
Okay.
Except for, we're going to talk about the Interstate Compact in a second. That would be trying to an end run around the constitutional provisions, but which we can get to. I think your question begs the broader question is whether that would be a good thing to have a popular vote rather than an Electoral College tally do it, determine the presidency. And I have a great concern about that. There's two kinds of national popular votes. There's a popular plurality system and a popular majority system. Popular plurality means you just have to have one more vote than the second place finisher. And there is a great deal of evidence that despite our focusing now on a polarized electorate, the reality is, as was there's a wonderful story in the New York Times this week by Lee Drutman that says if you do a really good analysis of what citizens want by looking at public opinion surveys and stuff, you'll see that there are really about 6 real parties. The Republicans have 3 different branches. The Democrats have 3 different branches. And in this system of a national plurality election, somebody who would get, a plurality, less than 30% could easily win if citizens are in a multi-party election, are distributing their votes widely among various candidates. And I would submit to you that a president who gets less than 30% or even less than 40% is not likely to be considered legitimate or is unlikely to be effective at governance, because presidents require a strong basis of support to get anything done.
Right. Well, I hadn't even thought about that. Andrea, what is your response to that, to the different parties within the parties? Do you agree
I
with
think
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty spot on. I didn't know that, in terms of what the subunits are. I mean, certainly within the two major political parties, we see differing factions within each group. To me, what this, would the getting rid of the Electoral College require a constitutional amendment question is really getting to the heart of is, would, in this political climate, would we be able to ratify a constitutional amendment? And
what do you think?
I am not as convinced that that would be something that is like will happen, but that might just be the political context that we're living in talking, me talking. So
well, let's switch this a little bit and drill down to the Interstate Compact. You've both referenced that. So what is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, and how many states have already entered into it? Who'd like to go first on that one? Andrea, are you?
Well, I can, I'm not 100% sure on how many states there are. The last time I checked, it was, I think, or somewhere around 15 or 20, but I don't want to be quoted on that. So the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact that we were alluding to is basically states signing on to agree to give their electoral college votes to the winner of the popular vote. And that's kind of right, of the national popular vote. So as opposed to states allocating electoral college votes based on the state vote count, it would be based on the national vote count. And the idea is that if enough states sign on, you can get to an electoral college victory because all the states are agreeing to kind of push in on the winner of the national popular vote.
Not all states. You only have to have enough states that control 270 electoral college votes. And now the 15 states that you mentioned, plus the District of Columbia, have control 196 electoral votes. So they would need another 75 electoral votes or so to do it, and they would need states who control that amount to do it. And I can give you the states that are likely candidates. There are states that did vote for Biden that might be willing to do that in the next few years. I don't think that's going to happen, but it is possible. I don't think it would be desirable. Can you imagine the upheaval in those states that their electors from their states voted against what the outcome was in their state in order to put the national vote as a priority? So I think that would be challenged in all over the place. Congress would probably get rid of the law that allows such interstate compacts. The Supreme Court would probably overwhelm it. There'd be lawsuits all over the place if that were to occur. And let's just understand, Americans have a very dear attachment to the Constitution. And they would think that any end around the Constitution is just illegitimate.
So
So
those states.
I love the people who came up with this very clever idea. I know them well, and I think they're brilliant people, but no, it's not a good idea in the end.
Well, the 15 states that have already joined that compact, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, talk about a mouthful. So is the way they vote for elections different, or what is the benefit for those 15 states for having passed that? Do the results of their elections differ from the other states? So is it an ideological?
It is true that the states where it has passed have been Democratic. There is all the states, the 17 or the 16 counting this District of Columbia, they tend to vote Democratic. So there is that bias. But the real thought was it's going to give the bigger states more clout, even out that small state advantage from the Electoral College.
Okay.
So,
And
but it doesn't affect their current operations now.
Okay.
Nothing happens until 270 votes are assured by the states controlling that number of votes have agreed to the compact. Nothing happens until that happens.
I can't help but wonder, though, when we get enough states to agree to that, but there are 270, do the other states have no input into the presidential election under this theory?
Well, sure, it would always change year to year, which would be the states that were, affected by that.
Yeah.
Everybody's votes would still, in some sense, matter.
Doesn't sound like it.
Yeah, not very much, though. You're right.
No, it doesn't. Maybe in theory, but Andrea, you started to say something about that.
Well, I was going to mention that if for some reason enough states signed on that it was getting close to the 270 needed to kick in the compact. I don't know that states that have already signed on wouldn't reconsider what their decision was, because they can always back out of it. So if at a point that we get too close, then states might be thinking, okay, now that this is real, is this really what we want to do?
So you think it was a political
Well, I think there would be
grandstand?
clauses in the contract that would prevent them from backing out during an election cycle. They would, but I think once they got burned, then they would back out and we would be back to what we had.
Okay. Interesting. You were teaching me things that I didn't know about that, and I'm sure there are some others on the call that agree. So did we already answer this question? Do you suppose that is this whole national popular vote and the Interstate Compact, are they consistent with democratic principles? And that would be small d democratic. Have we covered that, or no?
Well, I would say doing a national popular vote would be closer to small d democratic principles than the Interstate Compact.
Okay.
One thing that somebody did point out in the chat that we didn't really talk about a lot, which was what are the drawbacks of using a national popular vote? And certainly that would be now, if you're going to win an election by getting as many people to vote for you as possible, there's an incentive to go to areas where there's high populations. So who does that leave out?
Okay. Thank you. Well, I'm going to take a look at a couple of
I think
our chat questions.
One of the problems.
Go ahead, Paul. Paul, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to? I interrupted you. I apologize.
Oh, I didn't mean. I thought I interrupted you, so I was backing away. Now I forgot where I was going with that. I think, well, I guess where I was going was you were asking which, would a national popular vote be consistent with democratic principles? But again, there are so many democratic principles. And so I don't, for example, one democratic principle is that people ought to have multiple choices in terms of who they can vote for and who has a legitimate chance of winning. And
Right.
So we've learned to become what political scientists call sophisticated voters. We don't vote for our genuine preferences. I really wanted Ralph Nader to win in 2000, but I voted for Gore because I knew he had a chance. And that's the way people are. They just understand the way the Electoral College votes. We need to vote for a realistic contender, not for our ideal candidate. So we don't go with what we want. And so in a sense, democracy is undermined by having two parties and with its bias against third parties. On the other hand, if we have multiple parties, you could easily get, as I suggested earlier, a party winning with less than 30% of the vote winning, and you'd get extremist parties that were not representative of the majority of people. So I think the best solution, if we just stay with the two big opportunities of popular vote, the popular majority or the popular plurality, I would prefer the popular majoritarian, where we'd have a runoff between the top two vote getters that would require somebody getting to be widely accepted.
Okay.
But there's a better way to do it than that, which we're going to get to in a minute.
Yes, we are. Thank you. Andrea, before we move on to the ranked choice voting, do you have anything to add?
No.
Well, then something that Paul alluded to, and I'm sure most of our participants have heard about, is ranked choice voting. Unfortunately, many of us heard about ranked choice voting because of the debacle of the New York mayoral primary. So, Andrea, would you give us a 30-second explanation of how ranked choice voting works?
Well, the big picture view is that candidates rank choice, voters rank choice their candidates from most preferred to least preferred. And then if the candidate, looking at the first round of votes, we're saying, what's everybody's first preference? Does a candidate get a majority based on first preference? And if the answer is yes, then okay. If the answer is no, then it starts looking at some of the voters' second round choices. So what happens is the candidate with the least amount of first preference votes drops off the list. And then the voters that voted for that candidate first, we now look at their second choice and reallocate those votes back into the equation. So that I think, to me, the short version of how to think about ranked choice is by being able to rank choice your candidates, even if you're voting for a candidate that on the first round loses, your vote is still going to matter in the final tabulation.
And it's hard to understand, but would you repeat that bottom, your summation of that? So why is ranked choice voting good for the average voter?
Well, it gives voters more of a choice. And but going back to what Paul was saying earlier, is the way people are strategic voting now, they're not choosing their first preference, right? They're voting for who they are okay with, that they think has a chance of winning. With ranked choice, you can actually put your first preference at the top. And if that person doesn't get enough votes to stay in the race, well, now we're going down to your second preference, and that vote is going to count. So it gives voters more of a say.
Okay. And in New York, to go back to that, some of the voters said, well, we only knew the first candidate we wanted to vote for. You know, we had 5 votes and we didn't have enough information about 5 candidates. So that was held up as a faulty system. Paul, what would you say about that?
Well, I think using the example of New York is wise. I mean, Maine has adopted rank order voting for presidential. New York hasn't done it for presidential votes.
Mhm.
Alaska has adopted it for future presidential candidates or elections. So it can be seen as not something to be done at the national level. It could be part of a change going on within the states to get a better sense of what the citizens of the state, how they want all those electoral votes to be allocated. I don't think that it's too much to ask voters to make a choice, a rank order, the possibilities. We do it all the time. They do it for the Oscars. That's how they determine who the winners of the best pictures are. That's how we figure out who's going to be in the big contest of football at the end of the year. We do rank order, and we are expected to do that on trivial things, we should be able to do that when we're thinking about candidates for president. So yeah, I could, it might challenge voters to think beyond who they want. I want a system where people are thought to think about who do they trust? Who do they think is qualified to be president? And then rank order them on the basis of that, and giving, not rank ordering, just not listing a candidate who they don't trust.
Right.
So if some candidate is not trusted by a majority, he can't possibly win. He wouldn't be even last ranked. He wouldn't be ranked at all. That would keep those charlatans away from the presidency.
Well, to Andrea's point earlier, Kansas knows that their vote for president really doesn't count. Am I paraphrasing you accurately there, Andrea?
Well, I mean, certainly if you're a Republican in Kansas, you would like to make sure that a Republican wins the Electoral College votes in Kansas. But yes, it does, because Kansas is almost guaranteed to go to a Republican. It can actually affect voter turnout, because there's sort of a cynicism or an apathy about why would I bother voting if it's not going to make a difference.
So do you think ranked choice voting would entice more voters?
Yes. And I think it goes to two things. One, certainly there was confusion in New York, but after people come to realize what ranked choice voting is, it becomes more natural. So there's this process of people learning what is going on so that they can then make informed choices. But the other part of this, as you know, Paul mentioned, in Maine, they've used ranked choice. And in 2018, in one of their congressional elections, ranked choice actually made a difference in terms of how the election results came out. So what would have happened with a plurality election versus what happened with ranked choice, two different candidates would have been winners. The person that ended up losing actually did sue to try to contest that, and the courts upheld the ranked choice voting system. So to me, ranked choice gives voters more of an opportunity to have a say in government.
A question just came in. We talk about states that have used ranked choice voting. Is there a country that has a preferable voting system for president? And if so, what country would that be? And what is their system? So is there a country that does something better than America and elects their president in a preferable way? That's what that question is, I think. Who wants to answer it?
Well, let's just say that rank order voting is used not necessarily for presidential elections, but for like legislative elections and things like that in Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, and so forth. Are they better governed? I don't know. I think a better example is local elections in the United States. About 10 major communities ranging from San Francisco to Cambridge to Nashville, or was it Memphis, to Santa Fe, places like that, San Francisco, wherever. They have used this, and it's worked really well. It's worked in, not only does it give citizens more choices and a way to think about how they want to allocate their votes, but it also encourages the candidates to be much more careful in how they campaign. They don't want to insult the other candidates because they don't want to lose their second and third. You know, they want the supporters of the people who are not their first choice to move to them. So you get much more collaborative kind of processes, and that goes over into the actual legislative and governing processes. You see a lot less polarization in some of those communities than you see in states or localities that are much more partisan.
Well, less polarization is certainly desirable. What were you going to say, Andrea?
Well, I was going to say another way, in addition to states and localities, look at political parties. We currently have the two-party system. So if you're thinking about the primaries in 2020 and how divisive that became, when political parties are using a ranked choice to select their nominee, the people within the party probably feel a little bit better about their voice being heard, because it's not, so there's that element as well.
What would it take for the country to move to a ranked choice voting system?
For the whole country, it
Yeah.
would require a constitutional amendment, which is, as Andrea pointed out, highly unlikely at the present. But I do think that it's possible in the next couple of decades to get there. I think younger voters are pretty fed up with the present system we have. I think that at some point there could be what I would call a national movement, based a democratic movement to try to change this system. And I think, once that comes out, people will start talking about whether, a popular plurality, a popular majority, or a rank order voting system would be preferable. And it would take some time for all that to flush itself through our democracy. But, these come from political scientists, they should come from the people. This will take a while to occur, but I think people have to start thinking about politics differently. They have to stop thinking about politics as how do we get the candidate and the party we most prefer that represents our ideology, our interests, our identities, and instead ask which people do we trust to govern us on a long-term basis. And I think we need a different system entirely that changes the way we approach politics. We have to think about differently.
And
we need to think
Andrea,
about who do we trust, not who do I want.
Andrea,
And I say we trust. I have to think about, are these candidates acceptable to women, to minorities, to all the people that I think are marginalized and underrepresented. I want somebody that they trust, because unless we trust our government, we don't obey it. We don't give it legitimacy.
Yeah.
And that's the real underlying problem that we have in America today.
Well, Andrea, Paul was talking a little bit about he thinks younger people could possibly be getting fed up or will be fed up. And you've done a lot of research on engaging younger people into the community and government. What do you think? Are we at that point where younger people might be standing up and saying enough and let's do this?
We're certainly close. I do agree that younger people right now, if you think about the two-party system, they're not necessarily falling easily into that dynamic. And so from a younger person's perspective, looking at our current system, it can be a little bit frustrating because they feel, people are telling them, we want you to be engaged, but at the same time, when they don't feel like their voices are being heard, even though they are engaged. And going back to the question about likelihood of our country adopting ranked choice, one thing that to me is a path towards that being more of a possibility is really looking at those state and local elections like Paul was talking about. So if you can get it working on the state and local level, people feel more of a comfort with it. That creates a space for people to kind of have more understanding about ranked choice and what it could mean at the national level and why that might be a way to go. So to me, the pathway for the nation adopting ranked choice would be kind of doing the fusion from local and state up to the national.
How do you make ranked choice voting possible in a state? Is it a state constitutional amendment?
It would probably depend on the state. It would, in the
I
very
don't think
least,
it does requires a constitutional amendment in both states. I think most states by statute determine how elections are run.
right. So they could just pass legislation and change the way
Okay.
they're doing their elections.
So it would be the state legislatures
Right.
that could decide, not the election office, for example.
Well, in
Right.
Kansas, for example, the Democrats have rank order voting in their primaries that weren't held, but in theory, they did say our primaries should have rank order voting. And so that's not even the state decision, that's a party decision.
Gotcha. Thank you. Well, we've got time, just not a whole lot of time, but we're going to give 5 or so minutes to Paul, one of Paul's pet topics, and that's primary elections. And Paul, you claim, and I think rightly so, that primary elections are often overlooked. So, but how important is a primary?
Well, when I started getting interested in presidential elections, I never thought much about this. As you know, like primaries, we think about them as the general election, presidential elections. But I read an article by James Caesar, who was a conservative political scientist from Claremont, who said our primary systems aren't worthy of a banana republic. And he went into all of the problems with our primary systems. And the biggest problem is that, first of all, the primaries that we have pretty much changed the whole mindset of the Electoral College. We wanted the presidents to be nominated by people who were well-informed, who could make good judgments about who the candidates should be. Now the primaries are just choosing the most popular people, and not even the most popular understood in a majoritarian sense, but in, again, a very small sense. Just, do you have a base, enough of a base that you could be a contender? And so that leads to, now we have what political scientists call the permanent campaign. You have to, in order to become a nominee of a party and be one of the 2 finalists, you got to declare your candidacy even right after the end of the last election, to start getting enough support, mostly financial, media attention, and so forth, to be viable in the early primaries. The primaries now, almost all states have them, all but less than 5, and they start, early in the year in January in Nevada and New Hampshire, and then end up in June sometime. I don't know who the last states are now, but you have to run that whole cycle. So candidates are just trying to survive so that they can be still in play when the next primary occurs. And so they appeal to just enough of a base so that they can continue to get financial support and media attention to be a survivor. And so the candidates that are, we might call them vanilla, they're more neutral, they're more pragmatic, they're not so ideological. They tend to go away. I mean, think of Kamala Harris. I mean, she's hard to pigeonhole, but she couldn't get enough support early on to be viable, and so she went away. And so a lot of the major good candidates, in my judgment, get winnowed out early on, and we get what I would call a lot of showboats running and getting staying alive and surviving.
So, Andrea, do you think that primaries skew the nomination process?
Yes, short answer. And again, going back to what Paul was saying, because of the process that we're using, the winnowing of candidates is basically determined by a small number of voters. So it's not very inclusive, certainly, but it isn't really as consistent with going back to those democratic principles when you have a handful of states pretty much winnowing down your candidate pool. So it does skew the nomination process.
Yeah. And Paul, last question. From your view, would it make more sense to have a national primary?
I think so. But I want to emphasize, in my book, I propose a national approval ballot. That is, I would like to see all the people who are interested in being president meeting certain criteria. Won't get into all that. But let's say we have 25 people who are sort of legitimate candidates for the presidency. They should all be on a very, very long ballot. And citizens should just say, do you approve or do you disapprove of each of these people? And in order to go on to the next general election, to the general election, you have to have more approval than disapproval. That will get rid of any candidates who most people disapprove of. And then you have to be in the top, let's say, 5 candidates having the greatest net approval, more approval than disapproval. That should give us the candidates who are serious. Would then be those who would vote or rank in the general rank order election.
Okay. And Andrea, you have any thoughts on that?
I did read part of Paul's book where he's talking about the approval voting, and I found it very fascinating. Personally, I do tend to agree that primaries should include a list of candidates that's beyond just the party nominees, because again, parties can still nominate their candidates, but it doesn't limit who can run for the election in that system. So I tend to, when I was reading that, I was like, oh, this is interesting. And I think this is, probably pretty spot on. I know that some places have looked into open primaries and top 2 primaries. And of course, with Paul's book, he's basically saying maybe the top 5 or so candidates would move on to the next round. So regardless of how that is, personally, I do believe that open primaries or, approval voting where you have a long list of candidates that you can make a choice on is far better for the voters.
Well, we've introduced a lot of ideas here, and I thank you for that. To be fair to everybody, I'd like to ask some of the questions posted in the chat. Are you two ready to play speedball with questions? So would national ranked choice voting dissolve the political parties? Yes or no?
They would
Thumbs
still
up?
exist, but it might in the long term mean that more parties actually have a shot.
Do you agree with that, Paul?
Yes, I think that we tend to emphasize that the Electoral College is supported by politicians from small states. It's opposed by all politicians, because Republicans and Democrats, they don't want more competition from third parties. And so we have so many provisions that that are contrary, opposed to the legitimate interests of third parties, make it very hard for them to compete. So I think you have to start changing the state laws that make it so difficult for, like the Green Party or whatever, to compete at a national level.
Thank you. We were asked to give a succinct definition about a democracy versus a republic. Exactly what would you say is the difference?
I would say democracy is much more committed to equal citizen equality and ensuring one person, one vote, that all citizens are to be accorded equal respect and equal standing and equal vote, not necessarily equal power, but equal capacity to determine their representatives. I think republicanism is a system which stresses not citizen involvement, but the separation of powers, with the idea being that only things that are in the true national interests will be adapted and pursued. The public interest trumps individual choice and individual participation.
Andrea, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I don't have really much else to add about that.
Okay. That's a little bit of a confusing question because when we use democratic and democracy, sometimes people might think we're talking about parties, but we're talking about overall systems there. So I appreciate Marion's question there. Marcia had asked a question. Let's see. If the system is much harder than financing reform, say if the system change is much harder than financing, wouldn't many of the issues of voter choice be solved by political campaigns? Even ranked order voting gives advantage to the well-funded. So there, bottom line, do you think it's the people that are well-funded or personally wealthy that have the advantage in the systems?
I suppose absent
Yes.
public financing of elections, that would always probably be true.
Has it always been true since the get-go?
Well, what we know from history and from recent literature is that there is some what I would call responsiveness to citizens generally, to voters generally, but the research shows that the people who are primarily advantaged in the system are people who are well off and are well organized. That tends not to be people who are resource poor. So, even though democracy seems to be a situation where in theory it provides equal power to everybody, in reality, because of the disjunction between who participates and your resources, it tends to favor the well-off.
Do you
It always
think
has.
always has?
Yeah.
Okay. How are the Electoral College candidates decided in ranked choice voting? We needed a clarification on that.
So if I'm reading this question correctly, basically, if we were to adopt ranked choice, we would be getting rid of the Electoral College. So it wouldn't really, there wouldn't be any choosing of electors, as they wouldn't really exist in this.
Well, I do think you could have rank order voting with the Electoral College. That is, each state that adopts rank order voting could use that to determine their electors. Then the question would be, well, how are you going to allocate the electors? Are you going to continue to allocate them on a winner-take-all ballot basis or unit rule that we have right now, where all of the electors go to the candidate who wins the rank order competition? But you could actually have different rank order voting schemes. You could have what's called a board account, where instead of transferring votes, like Andrea said, you could just count up weigh them. In other words, if I voted, my first choice could get my count 5 times, my second choice 4 times, my third choice 3 times, and so forth. And rank up, add up how people are ranked in total, And then you would get a dispersion of total weighted votes that could be allocated, could be used to allocate electors from the state. You see what I'm saying? That you could, you could get the person who gets the most weighted votes could get the majority, but not all of the electors in the state.
Right. And that kind of circles back to, something that I probably mentioned in one of our earlier discussions about proportional representation of electoral college votes. Because states could certainly allocate electoral college votes, however they choose to allocate electoral college votes. Most of them currently do use the winner take all, but they don't have to.
Right.
Only 2 states don't use winner take all, but they don't have proportional. They have district plans, which that's another topic we could get into. But where was I going with that? Just leave it at that.
Okay. You like me, Paul, sometimes we get crowded minds and all of our words are fighting for space there, I think. So we have a question from Marcus, and he said that you both mentioned that campaigners know they don't need to contact all voters in order to win. So if we were to move to a popular vote, particularly if it could be won by a plurality and not a majority, is there a worry that campaigners will focus on media markets instead of states? And is there a concern this media market focus? Oops, go ahead.
I don't know if it'd be any different than it is now in terms of total media attention being important. Media attention is very important now and will always be important.
What do you think, Andrea?
Well, I think, this is one of those questions from earlier where one of the things, especially if you're doing plurality for national popular vote, the candidate strategy would start to look at urban areas with larger populations. And so, when you're running advertisements in those large areas, I think what Marcus is asking that latter part of the question is because of the focus in those media markets, would that widen the ideological gap or the participatory gap? It's not possibly. I mean, the thing is, to me, it all centers back down to what we mean when we say media markets. Because if a candidate is running ads in the Kansas City metro, it's going to reach on regular television. It's going to reach outside of the immediate metro into some of these less populous areas. But it certainly wouldn't reach, Western Kansas or something. So I can see where that question between Western and maybe Eastern Kansas, but within kind of more rural areas around the metro, it wouldn't really have the same impact.
One of the questions also about mass communication. In the early days of the Electoral College, we didn't have mass communication and travel could take days. So I guess mass communication, Edna's making an assumption here that because of mass communication, what's the impact? Is that kind of a redundant question? I'm sorry.
Well, and there's a follow-up, a couple down after that.
Oh, I see. There we go. Therefore, trusted electors were more practical. Today's media, internet, etc., adds a different and often distorting aspect to this as well. Do you all agree?
Well, I think the nature of the media is very, very important. And back in the 19th century, we had a lot of what I would call partisan journals, newspapers, and that's how things were distributed. News got out, people read their party line. Then we moved into a period more recently where we had what I would call really broad-based television. When we had 3 major networks and everybody got the same news from the same sources and so on, that created a different situation. Then we began to have much more segmented media markets, as now very clear in the internet world, where people just pay attention again to their not even their partisan things. It's just not Fox News versus CNBC. It's also all of the different websites that are providing a very, very focused and distorted view of the world.
Mhm.
So I don't know. I don't know if that answers the question. I just think there should be some attention to how we can break down the kind of segmented silos that we get our information from, so we are exposed to opposite points of view.
You have anything to add to that, Andrea?
Yeah, certainly I do think that the media adds an element here. I guess the part of the question that I'm struggling with a little bit is kind of the underlying assumption that electors in early American history were always doing what the voters of the state wanted them to do, or that they were trusted electors, or that somehow historically electors behaved one way. And I kind of just think about, another one of the times when the Electoral College vote was not, there was no clear winner Electoral College vote, and it did go to the House. And then there was some jockeying to kind of convince people to vote for one presidential candidate versus the other. And so that's the underlying assumption is where I'm kind of not as convinced, I suppose.
So I think what I hear you saying is it's like the happy days, there isn't really a time that we can look back and say that the Electoral College accurately represented the will of all the people. Is that?
I
I'm
would,
sure.
I would, to way overgeneralize, I would say it worked exactly as it intended in 1788 and 1792, when George Washington was unanimously elected by all of the electors. They agreed that he was the most experienced, qualified, widely trusted person. Then at that point, after that, the Electoral College began to dissolve in terms of its independence, and it began to act as a partisan unit. They went along with either the Hamiltonians, the Federalists, or the Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republicans. And then by 1800, the electors were complete agents of the parties in Congress, doing their bidding. They were no longer determining what the who was most trusted, who was most qualified. They just wanted the partisan position.
So
what I'm interested in is, I think the problem with that was those electors were by design too elite, too narrow in their view. What I want is everybody to act like an elector, looking at the total landscape and figuring out who can be trusted.
Andrea, you have anything to add to that?
I don't.
Okay, well, we're going to take one more question, and then we're going to move on to the second part of the program on redistricting. And it's, oh boy, somebody else just asked a good question too, but the National Popular Vote Compact legislation failed in the Kansas legislature in 2021. Previously, it had GOP support, some GOP support. Why do you think that support has evaporated?
because we're a Republican state, and people would see that as they see the National Compact as a democratic tool to overcome the Electoral College, which tends to result in Republican presidents.
You agree with that, Andrea?
Right. And I think part of it is also a reflection of, the political parties right now are sort of in a transition. I don't want to say maybe transition is not the right word, but but the GOP in this particular question of years ago might not be the same GOP of today.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate your diplomacy. And so, no, I do appreciate it. I mean that sincerely. So I lied. I'm going to add one more question. And then, this is a heads up to Connie to get ready. But how long did it take for women and people of color to be picked to serve as an elector? Does anybody know?
I don't know the exact answer to that. I would say that the electors have been women and minorities in many instances for some time, I'd say for the last 50 years, relatively proportionately. But people who are electors are simply party regulars, people who have served the party well. They want to give them the honor of being an elector. So it's been an honorary position. And sometimes those people are women and sometimes minorities.
Andrea, you have anything to add to that?
Well, I am very quickly looking around for the answer. But I think the answer to both is probably sometime in the 70s or after.
Yeah, I had an answer to that one right off the top of my head. Too long. How long did it take? It took too long. How do you like that? Well, I would like to wrap this section up, and I want to thank you, Dr. Andrea Vieux, and you, Dr. Paul Schumacher. You've been a delight to work with. You're just such a wealth of information. This conversation could go on and on and on. And I hope that we have an opportunity to do some follow-up, maybe as a lunch and learn or in another time slot. So people that have time to ponder, we covered so much important information. I'm going to give people some time to process that and come back. And I also want to say that we send our thoughts and our prayers and our good wishes to Burdett Loomis, who was unable to join us on the panel today. We're thinking of him, and he helped us prepare for this and contributed to the questions we were going to ask. So want him to know that he is with us here in spirit. So Dr. Andrea Vieux, Dr. Paul Schumacher, round of applause for you two and our thanks. And I'm going to switch this over to Connie now. Connie, are you ready?
Well, thank you.
I'm ready.
Thank you, Connie. Here you go. So, Connie, I want to introduce you real quick. I got so involved in the conversation, I forgot this part. So, Connie is our league's redistricting champion, who is also known as the champ. She's not only formed a very strong local team to fight for fair maps in Johnson and Wyandotte counties, but she has also been instrumental in leading our statewide efforts for a transparent and fair redistricting process. Connie, we so appreciate you, and we're going to turn this over to you and your wonderful team. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Let me share my screen here for you guys. There we go. I want to thank everyone who submitted testimony, testified, and attended the redistricting town halls last month. Our people-powered Fair Maps team reviewed all the oral and written testimony for each of the town halls, and I want to just share some information about specifically the testimony that was given in the 3rd Congressional District. 201 people submitted testimony or testified in Overland Park, and another 33 testified in KCK. 185 people mentioned fair maps and the need to keep redistricting free from gerrymandering. 53 people mentioned the uniqueness of urban living compared to rural life, and many people mentioned keeping the Kansas City metropolitan area intact. So thank you again. Today, I'll be talking about how redistricting affects you as part of our community-centered mapping. We'll define what communities of interest is, and then we'll talk about its role in redistricting. And then finally, we'll use a free online mapping application called Districtor to map a community of interest. And all this will help you in your next round of redistricting testimony. Finally, we'll talk about those next steps you can take. So redistricting will impact you for the next 10 years with your choice of candidates, the elected offices you'll see on your ballot, the shared concerns of your community, and whether elected officials address your community's shared concerns. Think also of other impacts you'll see in the next 10 years. Changes to cell phone technology. And in 10 years, your 5-year-old child or grandchild will be 15 years old. And someone mentioned to me yesterday, think of it this way too. Your 8-year-old child or grandchild will be 18 and ready to vote. So what can we do? Well, we do know that district lines have to be drawn somewhere. We also know that the Kansas legislature's traditional guidelines include consideration for communities of interest. What is a community of interest? Well, it's a legal term in redistricting. And one of the best definitions I've seen is this: a community of interest is a neighborhood or area whose residents have shared culture, history, and policy concerns, and so would benefit from being represented in the same district. And following the town halls last month, a leaguer reported that a member of the redistricting committees appreciated her detailed written and oral testimony concerning her community of interest. The conversation we'll walk you through will give you the tools to empower you to define your own community of interest. And keeping communities together gives you a stronger voice in government. And good redistricting starts with your personal story of your community. You are the best experts to talk about your local community in a way no one else can. As we talk with a fellow leaguer about her community, think about those same characteristics for your community that you'll want to include in your testimony to the redistricting committees. We also have a map drawing summary that walks you through similar questions, and we'll share that document in the chat, and it's also available on the Leagued Redistricting webpage. Again, we'll be using a free online tool called Districtor that we use to draw community of interest maps. Our goal is for you to see how it works. And just to give you guys a heads up, this mapping session that we'll be doing today is a very condensed version of what we normally do. We usually include a lot more questions. We map more key locations, and we spend a good hour to an hour and a half, depending on the number of people who are participating. So I'd like to introduce you to some members of our team who are gonna be helping me today. Nancy Allen will be our map drawer. Hi, Nancy, thanks for joining us. We have Juliet Sinclair, who will be providing our technical assistance. Hi, Juliet. And then Marie Hernandez, who will be our neighborhood resident and whose community will map. So I'm going to stop sharing now and have Nancy share her screen so that we can get started and talk about Marie's community. And so what, wrong one. And so what we've done again is, you're on the script for Marie. Yes, we've scripted this portion. The map, please, Nancy. There you go. Yep. There you go. We have gone ahead and, again, like I said, we've identified some locations ahead of time just to kind of move this along. And so Nancy's going to go ahead and start, and she's going to name this as Marie's community of interest. So Marie, let's talk about your community. Why did you move there, and what do you love about your community?
Well, my mom and I needed a home that had a first floor bedroom. So we actually moved here because of that. And but I love the neighborhood because it's very centrally located to shops and to the doctor's office, and it has easy access to I-35, 435, and 69 highway.
Great, thank you for sharing that. So now let's identify some more key locations for you. What are the nearest cross streets to your home, or what's it close to?
It's close to Pleasant Ridge Elementary School, so the nearest cross streets are like Westgate Street and West 121st Street, or Terrace rather.
Okay, so we're gonna get into Pleasant Ridge Elementary School. There you go. And Marie, is this the neighborhood school that your neighborhood goes to?
Yes, it is.
And how do people usually get to the school? Do they walk or drive, or a combination of everything?
Oh, a combination. A ton of kids can walk, but then you have, if you're over there during the beginning or ending, there's a ton of traffic.
So would you consider traffic and safety to be a key concern in that community?
Yes.
Okay. So again, we've already mapped her emergency room and the place that she shops for groceries. So now, Marie, what are the places that you or others in your neighborhood are likely to gather? Is there a park? I see a couple parks nearby. Are those common parks there for you?
Well, there's the Westgate Park, which is a small park to the east of us that that is a favorite for family gatherings.
Okay.
And then Stoll Park, of course, is it's a big park, and it is a favorite because it has a lot of outdoor activity that like a dog park and things like that. And then Indian Creek runs right behind my house and has an awesome trail that a lot of people use, especially over COVID. It was extremely busy. And then I think if you were talking about moving out a little bit, it'd be like Deanna Rose Farmstead. It's used by families and, with kids and your grandkids. Great place to take them.
Okay, so what we've got are a lot of gathering places here. You've got the Westgate Park, which is near you, Stoll Park, that's still close to where you live, and they all have a lot of activity there. You talked about Indian Creek and their trail there, and then finally Deanna Rose. So you mentioned being centrally located and being able to access major interstates and highways. Going back out to your map there, Nancy, where do you usually get on 435? Would the closest one be at Quivira, or do you think it's more important at where the intersections are, like 435 and I-35?
I would normally, if I'd be at Quivira or 119th if I want to just go directly to 35. But
Okay,
I would say most people in the area probably head towards the Quivira one.
okay. So let's go ahead, Nancy and Mark, on Quivira as an access point to the interstates and even the highway there. And Highway 69, you mentioned that it's close to there. Is there anything with Highway 69 that's important for your community?
I think a lot of people, this is a commuter area, you know, people live or work, a lot of them work downtown, Kansas City metro area. So 69 is a huge part of people going to and from work.
Okay, so we've identified some key locations. And now let's talk about some of your biggest issues for your community that your friends and neighbors have talked about. You did mention the commuting aspect. And so what Nancy's going to do is she's going to put this in the description of the community that Marie's identifying here, what the big policy concerns are. So Marie, what are your biggest issues for your community that your friends and neighbors talk about?
I would think the education funding comes to the top from, you know, the funding of K through 12. College is always important to all the kids here. Johnson County Community College, of course, is a huge part of that. Protection of the environment. Indian Creek brings us very close to, because we have so many plants and animals that we see all the time, which are not usually blessed with that in an inner city, then it gives you a good glimpse of nature. And in reality, we have like 3 master gardeners in our cul-de-sac, because the nature is a big thing, and the ability to have the trail gives you a lot of outside time, enjoyment. Then I would say, I already mentioned that the commuting, but I would say the express toll lanes that are to be built on Highway 69 are a concern. I don't think people always understand exactly how that's supposed to work or necessarily agree with it, or just, you know. So I think, then I also think that because of Indian Creek, you have the issues of flooding that is a concern. With us here, then we have to have like 2 or 3 weeks of it, but downstream it's a huge thing. So climate change has become very important, because it's very obvious with the way the creek has changed in the time I've been here, that climate change and stormwater management resources and policies are a big issue.
Okay, so again, what we've done here is we've identified key places in Marie's community, and she's talked about policy concerns. And again, normally we would have a much broader discussion, a longer discussion of how her community of interest is. So what we're going to do now is we're going to paint or highlight Marie's community, and we're going to start right there right back at her south. Go ahead and erase that. South. We're going to start where the neighborhood school is at Pleasant Ridge. There we go. That's a good start. So Marie, starting with Pleasant Ridge, we'll go ahead and highlight that whole neighborhood between 119th Street and 127th, from Quivira to Flum. Does it go as far north as 435 and the regional hospital there? Or does it stop at 435, do you think?
I kind of think that my community would probably stop about 435.
Okay, and now let's go east. Does it go all the way to 69, or does it stop before that, or is 69 maybe a little further? Where do you think it stops on the eastern side?
I would think that it would stop maybe a little before, maybe more like around Schweitzer, that area. So a little before 69.
Okay. So you can delete the one that you just got.
Oh, when I look at that, I think I'm okay with that.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I'm okay
Well,
with that.
okay. So now let's go as far as, let's start going south here. Would you say that it includes the Deanna Rose farmhouse that's real way far south down there? Does it go that far south?
No, I think it does, because it also has those huge soccer fields, and we have a lot of soccer players. So a lot of people spend a lot of time there.
Okay. And then, so we're just past 135th Street. So let's go ahead and capture where Deanna Rose is. So now let's go west. Does it go all the way to 35, or does it stop before that, do you think?
I think it stops around Flum.
At Flum. Okay, so do you think it goes past 135th?
No,
Just only where Deanna Rose is. Okay, does that look good to capture what you envision your community of interest to be?
it does. It does.
Okay, so now we're gonna save this, and then we're gonna tag it KS Fair Maps. So tag your map down further, right there. Okay, and let's go ahead. Can you go back and copy that? We're gonna copy this URL and paste it in the chat. So, if somebody wants to go check it out and maybe add to it or do their own, they certainly can. The beauty of this is that, if Marie decides that she wants to, talk to her neighbors and other community members and say, hey, does this make sense to you? They can make modifications to it, and it won't change the integrity of the map that she's already created, which is the beauty of Districtor. And the other thing that Districtor will do is, Nancy, will you just go up to the hamburger and show them that that they can print this as a PDF? And then there's all sorts of export functions. So it includes the map and includes all the detailed descriptions that we put on each of the community key places and the descriptions of the community. So it talks about her policy concerns. She can utilize all this information in her next round of testimony to really personalize her community of interest and let her legislators know and the redistricting committee know that, hey, this is our community of interest. Please don't separate it. We want it to be together. We really need it to be together when it comes time for her House or Senate district. So thank you again, Marie. I appreciate you sharing your community with us and how important it is for community mapping. There is another way that you can export some files, depending on if the redistricting team will allow you to export those files, and hopefully we'll get some information there. So now let me go back to sharing my screen. Thank you again, Nancy and Juliet and Marie. I appreciate all of you more than you will ever know. So next steps that you can take. Well, talk to your friends and neighbors about the importance of redistricting, how it will affect them in the next 10 years, and how communities of interest can play a role. Request the League's assistance to map your community of interest. We meet every first and third Thursday of the month via Zoom. Juliet put a Google request form in the chat, and it's also on our redistricting webpage. We are more than happy to help you map your community of interest. Our call to action for you is to submit written testimony telling your personal story of your community of interest that advocates for your community's needs with state legislators and the Kansas redistricting committees, and testify at the next round of public hearings. I just wanted to let you guys know that the redistricting committees are still accepting written testimony. So be sure to continue to submit your written testimony and testify at the next round of public hearings. We don't know when they'll be, we don't know where they'll be, but we are continuing to monitor all that activity. Write a letter to the editor about your concerns with redistricting. Today, we've touched on redistricting and how it will impact you for the next 10 years. We have defined a community of interest and its role in redistricting. We've mapped a fellow leaguer's community of interest and provided you with next steps. Finally, the People-Powered Fair Maps Committee can walk you through identifying your community of interest so that you can tell your personal story with confidence to the redistricting committees. And for more information, be sure to follow the League on various social media platforms. Keep current on redistricting via the League's website. And we have this link that takes you directly to the redistricting webpage. Join our redistricting committees. And as always, feel free to reach out to me. My email is there if you have any questions or comments, or if you just want to just generally talk about redistricting.
I want to thank County Nancy, Juliet, and Marie again for showing us exactly how to advocate effectively for fair maps. What a wonderful presentation and demonstration. And thank you again to Drs. Vieux and Schumaker for providing important context about how we elect our president. A special thank you to Janet for bringing this panel together, stepping in as a moderator, and then leading such an interesting discussion. Before we close, I want to encourage you to join us for our discussion about critical race theory on Saturday, October 2nd. The board meets next week to decide whether this program will be in person or via Zoom. Watch your emails and our website for more information. Also, our incredible voter information team is hosting 7 candidate forums for local races this fall. You can find information about how to register for them on our events calendar at lwvjoco.org. You can also visit our YouTube page to watch candidate forums you've missed, as well as the forums that we hosted during the primaries. The easiest way to get to our YouTube channel is from our homepage, lwvjoco.org. If you are on a desktop, you'll see the YouTube icon at the top left of the page. On your phone, if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you'll see the YouTube icon. While you're there, please subscribe to our page. As you can see, we're working hard to educate and engage voters. Programs like these are only possible because of our members and their support. If you would like to find out more about becoming a member, please contact us through our website, lwvjoco.org, or email us at contactus@lwvjoco.org. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. We hope to see you again soon.